So we've got to the end of the circle theme now. So I'm going to choose a few of the samples that we've looked at to join together now for our last session. So just to recap over, we looked at initially Suffolk puffs and the different ways to do that. This one here for the panel that I've got for this piece is just a really simple one in the middle. We looked at curvelets and different curves there, that piece there. We looked at a couple of different types of applique. This one here was creating sort of an aperture and a reverse applique. This was folding strips of fabric folded together. So you've got almost this 3D element, the applique. We looked at doing tucks and the different ways of doing those inspired by Bojagi. And then we looked at couching, and a couple of the samples here I quite liked. I've got one here where it was just a piece of fabric cut into a circle, and then here one that I did out of a strip of jersey, so it's got more texture to it. We looked at weaving fabrics in all different ways. We've looked at stitching a few times. This one here, I know we also looked at mandala patterns of sort of doing those in a concentric circle. This one here is about filling a space there. So I'm just still working on that one, as we often do with our embroidery samples. They take the longest. So just going to fill that dense space of a circle there. The other one I just did quickly that there is a video for is just folding circles into quarters and creating this sort of 3D corsage shape as well. And then we finished last week on different ways of having a go with trapunto. So I'm just going to choose 6 of these to join together today, and we'll look at the different ways you could possibly put them together. I've chosen the 6 here that I'm going to work with. What I'm going to show you in a moment is this Bojagi interlocking seam that I've just sort of created on this top 2 here. So what that means is when we fold the seams on each other, we have a neat edge on the front and back of the piece. So that can be quite a nice technique if you want to have something hung up at, say, a window where you're going to see the front and back of it, and works well with quite lightweight fabrics. For these 2 here that I've got that I did with the applique, you can see here if I fold up this top layer, we've got that top layer, we've got some folded pieces of fabric, we've got a backing layer, and the same for this reverse applique one. So potentially doing a Bojagi lap seam where I'll fold one amount under and this way, what's going to happen is that's going to be really quite thick to sew and look quite bulky. So then what I might do is just leave the raw edge as it is, and I've got bias binding here. You could just simply cut some fabric and turn the edge under on it to create a strip like this, layer it over the top, and then stitch it down either side. So I can either have a stitch showing on the top, or I can sort of sew it down with a seam allowance, fold it over and do the same on the other. It's up to you. You can either have a gap with a piece of fabric between, or I can butt those up and lay that over the top. That's dependent on how much seam allowance you've got. Circle starts. This one here, again, these 2 are thinner, so I could do this Bojagi linked seam, or you can go for the old-fashioned right sides together, so a 0.5 centimetre or centimetre seam, either by back stitch or running stitch, or just use your sewing machine. So when it's pressed out, you've got that nice neat seam. What you'll find on the back is you'll have a raw edge. So then what you would do is create potentially a whole backing piece, the same size of all these joined, to join around the edge so that it covers that raw edge on the back. But what I will just show you to start with is doing the Bojagi seam, these 2 stuff. What I decided to do is change the piece here that I was using for the one with the Suffolk puff on. Again, another fairly thin piece of cotton. So for this one here with the tucks, on the side edge, the side there, So I'll have that as my top, this at the side. For this one here, I've pressed under the raw edge by 0.5 centimetre. And then this one here, I've pressed up the seam allowance by 0.5 centimetre. So what I'm going to do is interlock those together so that we're tucking the raw edge of this one inside. So if I just make sure it's sort of snugly in there and pin that in place, I can check I'm in line as well from looking at the back as well, that everything's in line and I've caught that raw edge there of the front fabric as well. So I'll get that lined up and pinned in place. And then what I've done here is I've threaded up some machine weight cotton thread so that my little stitches that I'm going to do in a moment, my little whip stitches, are going to be really subtle. So I'll just get that pinned in place. I've pinned that in place now. That's tucked in nicely. So I'm just going to fold along this crease here where the two fabrics. So I've got fold here of the seam and that's folded down the back. I've threaded up my needle and I'm just going to come up between the fold of this calico fabric there. If your thread is very thin, if you just sort of pull it through, leave a little tail and just do a few little anchoring stitches, and then you can just cut that end of thread off and that's anchored in there. What I am now going to do is a whip stitch over the top. So I'm coming out almost on the edge of this crease, going over to the other side at an angle, and then taking it through back to the calico side. So you'll see a little diagonal stitch that is coming, diagonal stitch coming over the top of this crease. So I'm going from this point here over and catching through the other printed fabric and then catching some of the calico fabric. So you don't want to go down very far into the seam, and I will continue in that way till I get to the other end. So just slight diagonals because you're just doing your stitches about 3 millimeters, sorry, out of shot there, 3 millimeters apart there. So I'll just grab some other samples to show you. Where it is slightly easier to see on this. So I use contrasting colours here. So here, where I had it folded, you can see I've come up, gone diagonally over, come back up to the navy, diagonally over to the green. So you can see, get that to focus again there. It's been folded over. So then when I open it out, it looks like this diagonal line here. And because we've only gone in marginally, so where we've got the fold of the fabric, we're not going down deep at all of that folded edge. We're kind of trying to work on the top of that fold so that when we open it out, it doesn't sort of put the fabric behind. What you'll find is from this side here, have a diagonal stitch, and then on the back where that's been made, you'll have a little vertical stitch. So when we sew the other side of the hem in a moment, and flip the work over to the back and follow that same process again, you'll see that the right side has more of the horizontal stitch. If we do it too deep, this diagonal whip stitch, you'd end up with longer lines here, and it would sort of leave a little tuck in your fabric. So perhaps just do a little practice to start with. Again, using a contrasting fabric like this, you're really going to see the stitching. On a patterned fabric, it's sort of subtle here. Or, as I'm doing on this one, I'm trying to use a tone on tone. It's really subtle, the diagonal stitches you're going to see along that seam. So I'll just run along to the end and open this one out. So very hard to see here because I've done tone on tone, but I've done all my whip stitches all the way along here. So on the back there, very subtly, is a really small horizontal stitch. So when it lays out flat, you can hardly see that. So that was our first fold. What you now do for the second part of this Bojagi seam is if I fold over to the other side, I'm now going to fold along the crease of this one here. So that's where they're interlocked together. I had taken the pins out whilst I was sewing, so you might just want to pop a couple back in so that you can crease it along this seam again now. So what I will now do again is put the end in, thread, and I'm just doing this diagonal slip stitch the way along the top of that fold. So because this diagonal stitch is happening on the back, when I then fold it out, the straight horizontal stitch will be on the front of the piece. So again, I'm doing this just be here, doing this in a contrasting colour just so you can see. But if you want really subtle seams done in this technique, you can just use a lighter colour there. So I'm just doing diagonally over, just try and keep them a similar distance apart. I've just got this diagonal line running all the way to the other side. So I've finished this edge now by doing my whip stitch there. So now when I flip to the right side here, you can see that the front now has got the horizontal small stitches. So that's why we want to keep the whip stitch over the edge as short as possible. Otherwise, these stitches here become really quite long. So this can be part of the appeal of it, is having this little almost stab stitch running down your piece. Or I could have done that in the cream as well. And then it's a really subtle way to join both sides of the fabric with no raw edges showing. So as I said, one of the other ways, the sort of most obvious way, would be to put right sides together, sew a centimetre seam allowance, so you get that same neat effect that you would have the raw edge on the back, which is fine if it's going to be hanging against a wall, or there is the option to put a backing piece on. The other thing I was just going to show you was to have a go at, so with just these four here, because these two are thicker, is potentially sort of cutting some bias binding. So rather than leave the gap between, which you could do and join that either side, as I said earlier in the video, is put them up against each other and sort of top stitch this on. So I could cut the piece here and then stitch either side of this bias binding, either by hand with a running stitch or on the machine, to both those separately, then butt them up against each other and run bias binding over the top there. Because it's not too thick, it lays okay over that middle bit there. And then again, sort of run either side of that. So I could then sort of make this into a cushion if you wanted to, or if you still want to sort of add this into a cushion, a hanging, what you could do is use the bias binding to encase the raw edges all the way around, like so. So then it would be all framed by this navy binding